All right, welcome into K-State Online. I'm Mason Voth going solo here today on a Friday. Drew is in transit right now as we speak, trying to get himself here as he's going to get to experience K-State basketball in person for the next week. He'll be with Fan and I down in Stillwater tomorrow when K-State and Oklahoma State play, and then obviously a week with two home games for K-State coming up against Utah and then Kansas next Saturday. So I'm going solo today. No big earth shattering football news in the last 24 hours. So we get to talk basketball like I was planning on. Now, look, everybody, I think, has some understanding of the fact that K State basketball is very important to me, very special. I've always been a college basketball over college football guy. It's just, how I'm wired. Baseball and basketball were always the two things that I was the most interested in. Obviously, have serious interest in football too, but basketball has always been really, really important to me. It's the thing that I typically look forward to the most during a year. I can remember thinking, like once you get to about like mid October, I'm going, man, I can't wait for basketball to start. Even those crappy games. Obviously, we now know that the last couple of years basketball hasn't been as fun for K State, and certainly there's a lot of conversations about what should be done with who's going to be in charge of coaching the team moving forward. Look, I think the contract's pretty prohibitive in what can be done there. So I think you're probably going to continue on the path that K-State has with Jerome Tang and everything. And I always think it's good to preface this stuff with like, I don't hold any ill will towards Jerome Tang, the person. It's just, I think being in this role and the struggles that the basketball team has had and how he has to address it sometimes have led to some incongruent answers and things that I don't agree with how they're handled. And it's unfortunate because when things were good, like this is a really awesome staff to have when you're good because they are so online and can be so promotional and amplify your message. I mean, of the 8 teams that were in the Elite 8 in 2023, I don't think there was a team that had a bigger profile in all of that because of what this staff was able to do and the personality that was there. But when things don't go well, that's, the big personalities typically are going to take a little bit more and it's going to be a little bit harder to stomach. And that's where we sit for K-State right now as they look like they're well on their way to missing a third straight NCAA tournament in a year that once again, there were resources there. There was a lot of promise built in to what this team could be. And so, you get to thinking about, okay, can this actually get fixed? Can this get turned around? Well, the concern to me is that you've essentially had 3 different teams in 3 years and you haven't been able to turn it around. And as you start to stack up more and more years after that run, it becomes easier to poke holes into why that first team was successful. Obviously, the first one people would point to is that Marquise Noel was brought in by the previous staff. He just stuck around, wanted the chance, and it worked out great. Keontae Johnson obviously had a heart problem that not many schools were going to clear him for or make him eligible to be on the floor because they were worried about what might be able to happen. K-State didn't have that concern. They found a diamond in the rough in Naquan Tomlin that obviously there were some issues there, and they were able to benefit from it for a year. It cost them in the second year. So many things just fell into place and went right for K-State. It's not to discredit what this staff did. I think they did some legitimate things that helped that team get to that position because Marquise Noel didn't play like that under Bruce Weber. He was a fine player, a guy that, hey, he can get minutes in the Big 12, be a contributor. I don't think anybody thought that Marquise Noel could be an All-American, and somebody had to believe in Keontae Johnson in some way. But so much of that team, when you look back and reflect on it now, is the personality of those guys aligned and matched up with this coaching staff. And that's where I start to look at what's going on now and think that K-State's probably in a position where because of the way that this staff is, I think you have to get the right type of people that are willing to be coached by them and spend all this time. Like they're not for certain people. Like I can tell you that if I was a college basketball player, I don't think this staff's persona and approach would work for me or be something that I was overly interested in. So typically in those scenarios, you would make the decision, hey, I'm going to go elsewhere that has a better personality fit for me. And that probably leads to why K-State doesn't seem to have an identity other than just being an embarrassment and bad, because you are bringing in guys that don't necessarily reflect the personality of the coaches that they have, like that first team did at K-State. And I think the best example of this would be if you go and look at last year's team and see that, look, Doug McDaniel was his own mess. I think he was going to be an issue and a problem no matter where he was at. So we can toss that one to the side. Nobody was saving Doug McDaniel. I mean, Penny Hardaway probably is the closest thing that you have to being a personality fit for him, and it's not going well there either. Coleman Hawkins, on the other hand, though, won a lot of basketball games at Illinois, was more than a serviceable player for Illinois, was really good. And there's, obviously some things went down on Twitter yesterday that had Coleman Hawkins back into the K-State frame of view. And there were Illinois fans coming to the rescue there and, just sticking up for their guy, because look, Illinois fans still hold Coleman Hawkins in high regard, as they should. K-State fans do not, as they should. But when you look at it and think about it, right from the get-go, it was clear that like this wasn't going to work for Coleman Hawkins. People can point to his podcast where he and Doug had conversations about basically just dumping on Shark Week and stuff, which you look back, the very first Tang team that was very influential in their season. And a lot of those guys all throughout the year spoke positively about it. And the first introduction really to those two guys was saying, hey, this thing that worked for a really, really good team and two really good players, not for us. It's silly. What are we doing here? And it was a significant shift in what Coleman Hawkins had in Brad Underwood as a head coach to Jerome Tang. Not to say that either approach is right or wrong, but you have to be able to get the players that respond to your approach. And over the last 3 years now, it's been a very small number of guys that have done that. Tyler Perry, I think, responded to it very well. And he was one of the few guys that, from start to finish, you couldn't question the effort that Tyler Perry gave in that second season. And he had so much more on his plate than he needed because of two guys that were supposed to be rotational players that weren't available the entire season, and other guys slumping really hard. But Tyler Perry really never let it dip. Now, did he not perform at times like what he was built up to be? Yeah, sure. But he was there. He was engaged with it. David Gasson obviously stuck around for 3 seasons. I think that's a guy you didn't have to worry about it in terms of his personality and how it matched up and how it fit. But now we're starting to see more signs of alluding to, hey, may not be working out the best for some of these guys here. So the driver of some of why I wanted to have this conversation today is a little bit of what Jerome Tang said after the game and the loss on Wednesday night to UCF. This is a little over a minute of Jerome Tang at his post-game press conference, and then we'll dissect after.
No. We knew what they was running. We knew exactly what they was running. We just didn't give a great enough effort. And so that's where, we talked all week long about, competing, right? Like competing, for everything, every inch of the floor, every possession, every screen, every pass. And I'm pretty sure I can go back and see that we weren't as competitive as we needed to be, fighting over those screens and getting. I knew they was running 22 to the corner for the 3, right? We knew the play, exactly what was going on, but we didn't. They cut harder than we did. That can't happen in those situations. I don't know. I hope they're pissed off. I hope they're sometimes, when we went through the earlier in the year, they came in and they were like, okay, coach, tell us what we need to do. You could tell they were very coachable at that time. They didn't think they had the answers. And hopefully with these 4 losses, they're going to come back in and say, okay, coach, we don't have the answers. You got to help us, because we're giving them what they need. They have to go out and they have to execute it. And at some point in time, it falls on their shoulders to do it. But
so that feels like a fairly damning statement to his players, is that Jerome Tang doesn't think that they are doing what they should be doing and that he's putting it on them. And look, he's been a pretty staunch player defender over his career. So I think there's some weight to him making that statement in that situation after the game against UCF. And it very well could be true. We were expecting a totally different look from K-State offensively this year. But if you want to poke some holes in it, I see things that, unless the players have just gone totally rogue on the coaching staff, then why, out of a timeout to stop a run, are you getting a shot clock violation against UCF? Or the look that you're getting is a three from Taj Manning? Why is the first offensive set you run in the game against UCF a three for Taj Manning? That's the kind of thing where you start to go, well, are they actually giving the right principles here? And that's where there are plenty of scenarios where players have to execute. K-State football didn't have a great season. They lost games because the coaching staff wasn't as good this year, but they also lost some games because I don't think the players were carrying their weight. And I think you could point to the game against Arizona as the best example of that. It was the most lifeless I had ever seen a football team at K-State. Certainly since I've been covering the team full time again, but you can take it all the way back to when I was in college and when I've been old enough to understand what's going on. They were dead going into that locker room at Arizona. I put that loss on them, and mainly the offense, because the defense was trying its best to keep them in the game, and we saw some energy from them. The offense didn't have anything. But with looking at this situation for K-State, it's hard to blame the players when last year was a problem and basically every single guy playing for you this year wasn't a major contributor last year or wasn't on the team. And you had problems 2 years ago and not a single one of these players was playing on that team. And so, while yes, it's totally plausible that players might not be executing what they are being told, it seems more likely that this is probably a program builder or coaching issue for K-State. And here's what's also difficult about this is that we really don't get a clear idea ever of what these players are actually supposed to do. The best insight that we got there from Jerome Tang was basically saying, hey, we knew what they were going to do on offense. We needed to go and stop this. We didn't give the effort to do it. Okay, that's fine. But that's pretty easy to surmise. Hey, their best players are going to do this on offense. We need to play hard to try to stop that. Okay. But on offense, what's going wrong there? Because that's been the biggest problem for K-State. And the defense by no means has been good in Big 12 play. But K-State has the worst offense through 4 games of the Big 12 season at this point in time. And this goes back to some things that have piled up over, the years with this team, is that at no point do they want to take accountability for the past in terms of, Jerome Tang did a little bit last year when I think it was something that was kind of easy and try to save face a little bit by saying, hey, I was coaching these guys wrong because of the NIL stuff, whatever. Okay. That's fine. But that doesn't really, it's not a basketball related thing. That's just like the mentality and the approach to how you're going to handle these guys. So when he gets asked after the Big 12 tournament loss last year that ends K-State season, how they're going to correct things or whatever, and he says, now's not the time to do it. Well, when is the time to do it? Because we know that K-State is very rarely made available in the offseason to talk about this stuff. And then at Media Day, each of the last 2 years, I've asked Jerome Tang questions that are kind of pertaining to, hey, how's this team going to be different from last year? You came up short last year. How are you? And he'll brush off and say, I want to talk about these guys. I don't want to talk about last year's team. Okay, that's fine to some extent, but the insight as to why you think something's going to be different, it is actually important. That it's not just one of those to fill time, or it's not just a generic question. People are genuinely curious right now, and you're not in a position to have the benefit of doubt if you're K-State and the coaching staff at this point in time. I would also say, in terms of asking for, how this plays out, with zero public reflection, you just then will pin it on hey, people got to believe in this, or we know what we're doing. He's had the "I'm built for this" comment after the Arizona State game. I guess you're built to be in this position. Are you built to respond from it, though? And that would be one of the things where if you don't have that public reflection, then people are just having to still go off of, the crazy faith moniker to take that from 2023, which, like, look, it works when you're winning and things are going really well. People don't need to understand it as long as the results are there. But when the results aren't there, people need to understand, or at least hear, hey, here's how we're trying to get to the proper results, or here's what we're doing that we think is going to get us there, but it's just not working for some reason. And so the other aspect of what Jerome Tang said, if you want to read into it a lot, which I think at this stage we really have to, like, this program is in shambles. This is not what K-State basketball should look like. If he says that early in the season the guys came in eager to get to work, which, I question in some ways too, because, and maybe they just thought when that losing streak happened that against Bowling Green and Seton Hall, it was just going to come to them easy because, hey, we're focused here in practice and we're trying to get better. These teams aren't that good. We'll go in, we'll take care of business at home. And they had that disastrous week where they lost to both of them and they suffered a 4-game losing streak. Maybe they were still coming in and asking and stuff. But why would it stop now for this team? And does that mean that they aren't coachable anymore? Or circle back around to talking about how Coleman Hawkins relates into this. Are you once again bringing in guys that don't match up with your staff and your program? Because that's how you maximize this thing. And so if you have guys that don't find the fit and they don't buy into what's being subscribed to them from this team, well, then you're not going to be able to get them to play to that level, and that's a problem. That goes back to, this team has had an issue with the players, whether it's the actual recruiting or is it the coaching side of it, but the players you bring in have to be able to mesh, and if they're not going to do that, this would tell me that you've once again brought in more players that have kind of tuned out what's being sold to them from this coaching staff. That's the problem. You have no chance to win if that's the case. Even if you have guys that don't necessarily mesh well or not the best players, if they're still going to listen and be respectful of the message and give effort to try to do it, even if it doesn't necessarily gel with them, you're going to at least have a chance. But if that's not happening right now, then there may not be a chance. And maybe that's the case because K-State's 0-4 in Big 12 play and just lost the game at home that they very easily could have won. And if you want to be a decent team in this league, they should have won. So that's concerning there. And I would equate this to, for those of you that are my age and of this generation and we're, baseball or sports fans, there was a game on the Wii called Mario Super Sluggers. And if you had a couple of like characters that were playing near each other in the field that had, some version of chemistry. So say you had Mario and Luigi, one's in left field and one's in center field. They could do some things above and beyond to make plays because they had the chemistry and it worked out together. That's kind of like what the 2023 version of K-State was, where Marquise Noel and Desi Sills and Keontae Johnson and all these guys that felt like they had something to prove and were so aligned with the mentality and of what Jerome Tang and his staff had, you got the best version of it. Last couple of years, these last two in particular, it's almost like you've got Mario and Bowser out there together, and it's not going to work out and come together for them. And I think that we are starting to either see that this staff is either very misguided in the players that they are adding or how they need to go about adding players, or that it is a very tiny and specific keyhole that players have to fit into to thrive for this team. And it's going to limit what you're going to be able to do to sustain consistent success. And as we're seeing right now in the third year of failing to probably make the NCAA tournament, you may never recapture what was there in year one for K-State. And that's why all of this feels just like it's a lost cause at this point. And the program's flailing because we hear so much about this problem or that problem, or even if you just, you're using the eye test, a different problem pops up and costs the team every game. Sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. And it's a lot easier to address problems when there's one very big specific one or a couple. Nothing is specific to this team. Any given night, it could be any problem that has ever plagued a basketball team. Like, I don't know that there's one thing right now that K-State does where you could say confidently, hey, that's at least going to be fine. That is an area of this team that is not going to be a problem. It's just not the case anymore for K-State. So we'll see what it looks like tomorrow night in Stillwater. But unfortunately, I think they are going to match that 0-5 start to Big 12 play that was had in 1997. That's the last time K-State lost their first 5 Big 12 games, and certainly trying to race against that 6 times in the last nearly 30 years. K-State has only won 4 conference games, failed to reach 5. K-State certainly doesn't want it to be the 7th instance this year, but I also think that is starting to be on the table. When you can't beat a team like UCF at home, makes it hard to see how you beat a team like Oklahoma State on the road. Those are both games that if you're trying to get back on track or you're just trying to be mildly competitive, you should get at least one of those, typically both of them. And the chances of that right now feel very slim for K-State. So as always, you hope that it gets flipped around and that things get better. But this hasn't proven to be the staff or the teams that can make the turnaround happen in a season. Like they made a mini one last year, but it still wasn't enough. So you didn't really turn it around. Turning it around would have been finishing the job last year and sliding in and making it to Dayton. That's what it would take this year. Making it to the bubble with like 3 weeks to go in the season, that doesn't matter anymore at this point. It's got to get better for K-State. And unfortunately, it just doesn't seem like that's going to happen this year. That'll be the 3rd year of it not getting right. And when you have 1 good year and 3 bad ones, makes it seem a whole lot more likely that year 5 would be more of the bad than the good. So that'll do it for today. We will be back late tomorrow night after K-State and Oklahoma State finish up in Stillwater for KSO Postgame Live, and then back on Monday with Drew talking about football and everything else going on. Transfer portal closes tonight for football. Guys can still commit, but if anybody's going to leave somewhere, they have to be in by this evening. So I'm Mason Voth. Appreciate everybody watching and listening to a solo version of the KSO show today, and I'll be back with Fan and Drew tomorrow after the Cats and the Pokes from Gallagher, Iowa.